History teaches us a singular, merciless truth: every great economic revolution carries within it the seeds of catastrophic collapse. Not because the innovation is flawed, but because human nature remains unchanging. We build magnificent machines of wealth creation, only to discover that we have constructed our own guillotines. This is not a story about failure. This is a story about the price of being first. The pattern repeats across centuries with mathematical precision. A visionary sees what others cannot. They create a financial instrument so elegant, so revolutionary, that it transforms the very fabric of commerce. Capital flows. Empires rise. And then, inevitably, the architects of this new world discover that they have opened Pandora's box. The same mechanisms that generated unprecedented wealth become weapons in the hands of those who understand their true nature. Not as tools of prosperity, but as instruments of economic warfare. Today, we stand at the edge of this familiar precipice. Derivatives. Algorithmic trading. Cryptocurrency. Each heralded as the future of finance. Each containing within it the capacity for systemic annihilation. But before we can understand where we are going, we must understand where we have been. The chessboard before us spans 5 centuries. 3 acts. 3 moments when genius collided with greed, when innovation met sabotage, when the new financial order was weaponized against its own creators. We begin in the jewel of the Adriatic, where a woman who could not legally exist in the world of commerce invented modern risk management. We will journey through Amsterdam, where the first publicly traded company became the first spectacular bubble. And we will end in London, where the marriage of finance and government created the template for modern economic warfare. Each case will reveal the same brutal truth: the innovator who changes the game rarely survives to enjoy their creation. Venice, 1453. The pearl of the Mediterranean. A city that should not exist, built on marshlands and willpower, had become the undisputed master of European commerce. While kingdoms across Europe fought petty wars over scraps of land, Venice played a different game entirely. The game of numbers. The game of routes. The game of controlling the invisible arteries through which Eastern wealth flowed into Western coffers. Imagine the Rialto at dawn. Not the tourist trap of modern fantasy, but the beating heart of global capitalism. Here, in a space no larger than a cathedral square, the entire economy of the known world was being negotiated, weighted, measured, and transformed into gold. Spices from Ceylon. Silk from Cathay. Gemstones from Persia. Every cargo represented fortunes that could make or break noble families. Every voyage was a roll of cosmic dice. The mathematics were brutal in their simplicity. A single successful voyage from Alexandria could return 30 times the initial investment. But the odds? Perhaps 1 in 3 ships made it home. Pirates prowled every shipping lane. Storms turned the Mediterranean into a graveyard. And now, the Ottoman shadow had fallen across the traditional overland routes, forcing everything onto the increasingly dangerous sea lanes. The Genoese, eternal rivals, circled like sharks, ready to exploit any Venetian weakness. Venice was rich beyond measure, but it was bleeding. Every lost cargo was a dagger to the Republic's supremacy. Risk had become unsustainable. The old certainties were crumbling. Into this crucible stepped a ghost. Or rather, a ghost's daughter. Domenico Rossetti had been Venice's most brilliant mind, a mathematician who could predict tides, calculate compound interest in his head, and saw patterns where others saw only chaos. He had died 5 years earlier, leaving behind volumes of work that the merchant guilds dismissed as academic curiosities. Too theoretical. Too abstract. Real men of commerce dealt in tangible goods, not theoretical probabilities. They had missed what his daughter Isabella had not. At 23, Isabella Rossetti possessed her father's genius but lacked the one credential that mattered in 1453 Venice: a penis. Women could not join guilds. Could not own ships. Could not legally conduct business beyond running a shop or managing a household. The most brilliant financial mind of her generation was legally invisible. But invisibility, she would discover, could be a weapon. Isabella's innovation was deceptively simple. Radical in its implications. And absolutely heretical in its mathematics. She had taken her father's actuarial tables, calculations of probability that seemed like sorcery to most merchants, and created something that had never existed before: quantified risk. Not guesswork. Not intuition. Not prayers to Saint Nicholas, patron of sailors. Mathematics. Cold, precise, and predictive. Her proposal was audacious. Merchants would pay a premium, a percentage of their cargo's value, into a common fund. In return, if their ship was lost, they would receive full compensation. But the genius was in the architecture. She didn't just create insurance. She created a financial instrument that could be securitized. Shares and future premiums could be sold to investors. The fund itself would grow exponentially as more merchants joined, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of capital accumulation and risk distribution. She called it Il Scudo Marino, the Sea Shield. She needed a proxy. Her cousin Marco was perfect. Handsome. Well-connected. Utterly mediocre. Ambitious enough to see the opportunity, but not intelligent enough to truly understand what he was selling. He would be the face. She would be the invisible architect, operating from the shadows of her family's palazzo, her existence in the company known only to Marco and the handful of lawyers who drew up the contracts in deliberately opaque language. The pitch was irresistible. To merchants, protection from the lottery of the seas. To investors, stable returns backed by mathematical certainty, not the whims of fate. To Venice itself, the ability to project commercial power without the paralyzing fear of catastrophic loss. Within 18 months, the Sea Shield had transformed from a curiosity into an institution. Half the merchant families of Venice had purchased policies. Investment shares traded hands in the Rialto for premiums above their face value. The Doge himself held shares. Even gondoliers had scraped together coins to buy fractional interests, seeing it as their path to security. Venice could now risk what Genoa could not. Venetian merchants sent out fleets that would have been unthinkably dangerous just 2 years earlier, because loss was no longer fatal. The Sea Shield covered the downside. The competition couldn't match this advantage. Venice's market dominance, already formidable, became absolute. Isabella had created a miracle. She had also created a target. Lorenzo Grimani had watched his fortunes erode for 2 years. A merchant prince from one of Venice's oldest families, he had survived by being more ruthless, more cunning, and more connected than his competitors. Traditional methods. Traditional alliances. The old ways that had built Venice. And now this upstart Marco, barely 30, with no distinguished lineage, no proven track record, had somehow conjured a commercial revolution from thin air? Impossible. Grimani smelled a rat. Or witchcraft. In Venice, they often amounted to the same thing. He began investigating. Slowly. Carefully. Following the money. Following the mathematics. And he found something interesting. The policies were too precise. The actuarial tables too sophisticated. This wasn't Marco's work. This had the fingerprints of someone with deep mathematical knowledge. Someone who understood probability theory at a level that few scholars, let alone merchants, could grasp. And then he found the connection to Domenico Rossetti. And Domenico's daughter. The reclusive Isabella, who supposedly spent her days embroidering and reading scripture. Grimani realized 2 things simultaneously. First, he had found the real architect. Second, he had found the perfect weapon. But Grimani was not merely greedy. He was vindictive. Destroying the Sea Shield would not be enough. He would destroy Venice's confidence in innovation itself. He would make an example so devastating that no one would dare challenge the old order again. His plan was diabolic in its elegance. He made contact with the Barbary corsairs through intermediaries. Not as an enemy of Venice, that would be treason. But as a businessman. He would provide them with information. The routes. The timing. The cargo manifests. Of the most heavily insured ships. In return for a share of the plunder. The Sea Shield's entire model depended on statistical distribution of risk. Losses would occur, yes, but spread across many voyages, the fund would remain solvent. But Grimani understood what Isabella had perhaps not fully accounted for: the model assumed random loss. It could not survive coordinated, targeted attacks. 3 ships. 3 simultaneous attacks. 3 catastrophic total losses. All within a 48-hour window. Combined insured value, more than the entire liquid capital of the Sea Shield. The fund couldn't cover it. Couldn't come close. The mathematical certainty had collided with intentional malice. The genius of the system became its vulnerability. Panic erupted across Venice like plague. Investors demanded redemption. Merchants who had paid premiums for years wanted refunds. The shares that had traded at 120% of face value crashed to worthless paper overnight. Families who had bet their fortunes on the Sea Shield faced ruin. And in the midst of this chaos, Grimani struck his final blow. He called a public assembly at the Doge's palace. Before the assembled powers of Venice, he presented his evidence. Not of his own conspiracy, that would remain forever hidden, but of Isabella's role. A woman, conducting business. Deceiving the guilds. Using mathematical formulas that, to the church's eye, looked suspiciously like numerology. Like witchcraft. The crowd's rage needed a target. Marco, weak and terrified, confessed everything. Confirmed Isabella's role. Begged for mercy. Isabella stood alone. Her creation had enriched thousands and bankrupted them just as quickly. Her innovation had elevated Venice and now threatened to tear it apart. And she faced a choice that echoed across the centuries: accept martyrdom for her genius, or fight back using the same ruthless calculus that had driven her persecutors. She chose war. Isabella had one advantage: she understood numbers better than anyone alive. And she had kept meticulous records. Every transaction. Every route. Every loss. And when she examined the pattern of the 3 catastrophic failures, she saw what should have been invisible: they weren't random. They were too perfect. Too coordinated. Too targeted at the Sea Shield's most exposed positions. Someone had known. And someone had acted. Standing before the Council of 10, Venice's secret police and the only body that could override the Inquisition, she made her case. Not a defense of her company. Not a plea for her life. But a prosecution. She demonstrated, using probability mathematics that even these hardened politicians could follow, that the odds of 3 such perfectly timed attacks occurring naturally were less than 1 in 10,000. This was enemy action. Against Venice itself. And then she provided the evidence. Shipping manifests that showed cargo information leaking before departure. Payment records showing unusual gold flows to known pirate intermediaries. All traced back, through careful detective work, to shell companies controlled by a certain prominent merchant family. The Grimani family. The council faced a choice. Burn a woman for witchcraft and business fraud, or arrest one of Venice's most powerful nobles for treason and economic warfare. The decision came down to power, not justice. Grimani had overreached. His conspiracy had not just targeted an upstart financial company, it had attacked the Venetian state itself. He was arrested. Tried in secret. Disappeared. The official story: death from sudden illness. The reality, a blade in the night and an unmarked grave in the lagoon. Isabella was spared. Barely. The sea shield was dissolved. Its investors lost everything, but Venice's oligarchs decided that was preferable to admitting that a woman had created the most sophisticated financial instrument of the age. Marco fled to Naples. Isabella returned to invisibility, her gender once again a prison. Her revolutionary idea was quietly stolen, repackaged by male merchants over the next decades, and eventually became the foundation of modern marine insurance. Her name disappeared from history. Her actual work? Scattered, attributed to others, or simply lost. Venice survived. But it had learned the wrong lesson. Innovation, the Republic's elites concluded, was dangerous. Better to stick with the old ways. The safe ways. Within a century, Venice would be a backwater, eclipsed by more daring nations willing to embrace risk and change. The genius who saved Venice by proving treachery had shown them the future. And they chose to look away. Nearly 2 centuries passed. The world had changed. Spain's gold fleets had transformed global commerce. Portugal had broken the Eastern monopoly. And a small, waterlogged republic had emerged from Spanish tyranny to become the most sophisticated commercial power the world had ever seen. Amsterdam, 1602. A miracle wrapped in pragmatism. While Europe's monarchies squandered their wealth on palaces and theology, the Dutch were perfecting something far more powerful, the machinery of modern capitalism. They had invented the first true stock exchange. The first central bank. The first short selling. They had taken the scattered innovations of medieval finance and forged them into an integrated system of breathtaking complexity. And at the center of this financial universe stood the VOC, the Verenigde Oostindische Company. The Dutch East India Company. This was not your grandfather's trading company. This was a corporate entity that possessed its own army. Its own navy. The legal authority to wage war, negotiate treaties, and colonize continents. A company-state hybrid that blurred the line between commerce and conquest. Between profit and empire. The VOC's innovation was structural. Instead of financing each voyage separately, the Venetian model, it created permanent capital. Investors bought shares in the company itself, not specific expeditions. Those shares could be traded on the Amsterdam exchange. Daily. Freely. Creating liquidity where none had existed before. The returns were intoxicating. The first decade saw dividends averaging 18% annually. But the true wealth was in the share price appreciation. 100 guilders invested in 1602 was worth 300 by 1610. 400 by 1620. The mathematics of compound growth, visualized in real time on the trading floor. But the Dutch were not content with simple equity trading. They wanted to extract every ounce of profit from every movement in price. So they invented something that would echo through financial history like a gunshot: derivative contracts. Options. The right, but not the obligation, to buy or sell VOC shares at a predetermined price on a future date. Suddenly, you could bet not just on whether the company would succeed, but on the timing, magnitude, and direction of every price movement. You could leverage your capital 10, 20, 50 times over. You could profit whether shares went up or down. The Dutch had weaponized time itself. And into this hypercharged environment stepped Isaac Maire, a man whose genius was matched only by his capacity for revenge. Maire had been one of the VOC's founding investors. A major shareholder. A believer in the vision. Until he disagreed with the company's directors on strategic direction. Until they forced him out. Bought his shares at a price he considered insulting. Humiliated him before the merchant community of Amsterdam. He was 53 years old. Wealthy, but not wealthy enough. Respected, but not powerful enough. And burning with a hatred that would reshape financial markets forever. Maire understood what the company's directors did not: the same derivative instruments that allowed speculation could be used for destruction. The market had evolved beyond simple supply and demand. It had become a complex system where perception mattered more than reality. Where coordinated action could trigger cascading consequences. Where the architecture itself could be exploited. He was going to short the VOC into oblivion. Short selling already existed, but Maire refined it into an art form. He would borrow VOC shares, sell them immediately, and wait for the price to collapse. Then buy them back at the lower price, return them to their owners, and pocket the difference. But borrowing and selling wasn't enough. He needed the price to actually fall. And fall dramatically. So he launched the first coordinated bear raid in financial history. The strategy was surgical. First, he recruited a group of wealthy merchants, men who had their own grievances against the VOC or who simply saw the profit potential. Together, they would sell massive quantities of shares and derivative contracts, creating selling pressure that would panic other investors. Second, he launched a propaganda campaign. Pamphlets appeared throughout Amsterdam detailing the VOC's mismanagement, its excessive risk-taking, its vulnerability to Portuguese counterattacks. Rumors circulated in taverns and coffeehouses. The company was overextended. The spice trade was collapsing. A major fleet had been lost. None of it was true. All of it was effective. Third, and most ingeniously, Maire realized that the VOC's share price was now tied to a complex web of derivative contracts. Options. Futures. Leveraged bets stacked on top of other bets. If the price started falling, it would trigger margin calls. Forced liquidations. A chain reaction of selling that would feed on itself. He had found the pressure point. He just needed to push. The attack began in early 1609. Maire's syndicate dumped shares onto the market in coordinated waves. The price dropped 10%. Then 15%. Panic rippled through the exchange. Investors who had bought on margin, using borrowed money, suddenly faced calls to put up more capital or have their positions liquidated. Many couldn't. So their shares were sold, driving the price down further. Which triggered more margin calls. More forced sales. Within 6 weeks, VOC shares had lost 40% of their value. Fortunes evaporated overnight. Families that had considered themselves secure were ruined. The entire Amsterdam financial system teetered on the edge of systemic collapse. Maire was triumphant. And he had made an enemy of the Dutch state itself. The VOC's directors faced annihilation. Not just of their company, but of the entire Dutch commercial empire. If the VOC collapsed, so would Amsterdam's credibility as a financial center. So would the Republic's ability to project power in Asia. So would the prosperity that had made a tiny nation of merchants into a global power. They appealed to the States General, the Dutch Parliament. And the States General did something unprecedented. They intervened in the market. Not with troops or censorship. With law. In February 1610, they banned short selling. Completely. Anyone caught borrowing shares to sell them would face prosecution. Derivative contracts used for bearish speculation would be unenforceable in courts. The state had just rewritten the rules of finance to save a single company. But they went further. The States General launched an investigation into Maire's syndicate. His propaganda campaign. His coordination with foreign interests, because by now, Spanish intelligence had noticed the chaos and was covertly funding additional bearish operations. Maire wasn't just attacking a company. He was, in the state's framing, committing economic warfare against the Republic itself. The prosecution was swift and merciless. Maire's co-conspirators were arrested, fined, and barred from trading. His assets were seized. His reputation destroyed. He fled Amsterdam for Antwerp, then still under Spanish control, and spent the rest of his life in bitter exile, watching from across the border as the VOC recovered and thrived. But Maire had proven something that the Dutch Republic could never fully suppress: financial markets, once sufficiently complex, could be weaponized. The same innovations that created liquidity and efficiency also created vulnerability. Derivative contracts could amplify both gains and destruction. And the line between legitimate trading and economic terrorism was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The VOC survived. It would dominate Asian trade for another century and a half. But the Dutch financial system had learned an uncomfortable truth: innovation without oversight was a loaded gun. And someone would always be willing to pull the trigger. The state's intervention set a precedent that echoes to this day. When financial engineering threatens systemic stability, the authorities will change the rules. Ban the instruments. Prosecute the traders. Sacrifice free market principles on the altar of survival. Maire died in 1624, bitter and broken. But his techniques lived on. Every short seller. Every hedge fund betting against overvalued companies. Every activist investor using derivatives to force corporate change. They are all his children. The VOC taught the world how to build a modern corporation. Maire taught the world how to destroy one. Two sides of the same coin. Two lessons from the same ledger. And between them, the template for every financial crisis that would follow. London, 1711. Britain was bleeding gold. Queen Anne's war against France had dragged on for a decade, draining the treasury and leaving the crown with a debt so massive it threatened the nation's solvency. Nearly £10 million, an astronomical sum that devoured tax revenues before a single soldier could be paid or ship could be built. Traditional solutions had failed. Raising taxes would spark rebellion. Defaulting would destroy Britain's credit and end its ambitions of empire. The crown needed a miracle. Instead, it got John Blunt, a scrivener's son with a talent for numbers and an even greater talent for deception. Blunt proposed something audacious: convert the national debt into equity in a private company. The South Sea Company would assume the government's obligations in exchange for exclusive trading rights in the Spanish colonies of South America. Investors holding government bonds would swap them for South Sea shares. The crown would be freed from its crushing debt. The company would profit from trade. And investors would transform their stagnant government paper into shares of a dynamic commercial enterprise. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was the greatest Ponzi scheme the world had yet seen. Because there was a problem at the heart of the South Sea Company: it had no real business. Britain and Spain were enemies. The exclusive trading rights were worthless. The company owned ships that never sailed to South America. Warehouses that stored nothing. Trading posts that existed only on fraudulent maps. But none of that mattered. Because Blunt understood something that Maire had glimpsed and Isabella had never fully grasped: in sufficiently complex financial markets, perception is more valuable than reality. If people believe the shares are valuable, they are valuable. Until they're not. The South Sea Company was not a trading company. It was a perpetual motion machine built from confidence, leverage, and lies. The genius of the scheme was in its self-reinforcing architecture. In 1720, the company proposed to assume even more government debt, £30 million in total. In return, Parliament granted the company additional privileges and the Crown provided implicit backing. And then Blunt launched his masterstroke: installment payments. Instead of requiring investors to pay the full share price up front, they could buy on credit, paying just 10% down and the rest over time. This explosive lever of credit detonated across London's financial district like a bomb. Suddenly, anyone with a few pounds could buy shares worth hundreds. The democratization of speculation. The laborer, the shopkeeper, the widow, all could participate in the South Sea miracle. Share prices that had languished at £120 rocketed to £200. then £500. Then £1,000 by August 1720. Every price increase validated the investment. Brought new buyers. Which drove the price higher still. The company paid dividends not from profits, there were none, but from the capital raised by selling new shares. Classic Ponzi mechanics, but executed at national scale with government complicity. Parliament was complicit because Parliament was invested. Ministers held shares. So did the king's mistresses. The Archbishop of Canterbury. Isaac Newton himself bought in, proclaiming, "I can calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people." The entire British establishment had bet their fortunes on a fiction. And then the ecosystem effects began. Hundreds of new companies launched, each promising revolutionary returns. Companies to drain the Irish bogs. To extract silver from lead. To build perpetual motion machines. One offered shares in a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. It raised £2,000 in a single day. The financial system had decoupled from reality entirely. Value was whatever you could convince someone to pay. And the madness fed on itself. The collapse, when it came, was not slow erosion but catastrophic implosion. In September 1720, some investors tried to cash out their gains. The company couldn't pay, its entire capital base was shares and promises, not liquid assets. Whispers of insolvency spread. The whispers became shouts. The price began to fall. And then the unthinkable happened, the margin calls began. Thousands of investors had bought on credit, putting down just 10% and owing the rest. As the share price fell, they were required to pay the remaining 90% immediately or forfeit their holdings. Almost none could pay. So their shares were dumped onto the market in forced sales, driving the price down faster. £1,000 per share in August. £800 in early September. £400 by month's end. £150 by October. The wealth of a nation evaporated in weeks. The devastation was total. Noble families that had stood for centuries were bankrupted overnight. Life savings vanished. Pensioners who had converted their government bonds into South Sea shares, believing they were making a safe, government-backed investment, were left destitute. Parliament convened emergency sessions. The public demanded blood. Blunt and the company's directors were arrested, their assets seized and distributed to victims, though it covered only a fraction of the losses. Several directors fled the country. One committed suicide. But here was the true genius of the crime: it was impossible to fully prosecute because the government itself had been the enabler. The Chancellor of the Exchequer had personally profited. The King's advisers had been paid off with shares. The regulatory framework had been deliberately weakened to allow the scheme to flourish. Punishing the South Sea Company meant punishing the British state. So the investigations were limited. The reforms were modest. And the lesson encoded into financial history was not prevent such schemes, but rather ensure the government exits before the collapse. Robert Walpole, who had opposed the scheme, became Prime Minister on the promise to restore order. He succeeded, but at a cost. Public trust in financial innovation was shattered for a generation. Britain's capital markets, which had been on the verge of surpassing Amsterdam's, retreated into conservatism. It would take decades to recover. The South Sea bubble demonstrated that the pattern identified in Venice and Amsterdam had reached its ultimate form. It was no longer individual actors like Isabella or Maire creating and weaponizing financial innovation. It was the state itself. Government and finance had merged into a single entity, capable of inflating bubbles of previously unimaginable scale, and inflicting correspondingly catastrophic damage when they burst. The machine had become sentient. And it had learned to feed on its own citizens. 3 centuries. 3 innovations. 3 catastrophes. The pattern is no longer theoretical. It is the operating system of modern capitalism. Isabella created securitized insurance and proved that mathematical risk models could be exploited through coordinated attacks. Maire created the bear raid and proved that derivative complexity creates systemic vulnerability. Blunt created the government-backed bubble and proved that when the state becomes the market, the collapse transcends economics and becomes existential. Each built upon the innovations of the previous. Each expanded the scale of destruction. Each revealed a fundamental truth that we continue to ignore: financial innovation and financial weaponization are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon observed at different moments in time. Consider the architecture of each collapse. In Venice, the attack was external: pirates hired to sink insured ships. In Amsterdam, the attack was internal: a bear raid exploiting derivative complexity. In London, there was no attack at all. The system collapsed under its own fraudulent weight. The trajectory is clear: each iteration required less external force to trigger catastrophe. The systems became simultaneously more sophisticated and more fragile. And what have we learned? Stand today in the glass canyons of Lower Manhattan or the steel towers of Shanghai and you will see the descendants of these innovations everywhere. Credit default swaps, Isabella's insurance, but on corporate debt rather than cargo ships. High-frequency algorithmic trading, Maire's bear raid, but executed in microseconds by machines. Government-backed mortgage securities, Blunt's debt for equity swap, but applied to millions of home loans. The 2008 financial crisis? Isabella's nightmare writ large. Coordinated defaults, not in shipping, but in housing, triggered cascading failures in insurance products called credit default swaps. The system that was supposed to distribute risk had actually concentrated it. The same mathematical elegance. The same catastrophic oversight. The 2010 flash crash. Maire's ghost in the machine. Algorithmic trading systems, designed to exploit microsecond price movements, created a feedback loop that erased nearly $1 trillion of value in minutes before recovering. Derivative complexity meeting technological leverage. The endless cycle of sovereign debt crises: Greece, Argentina, Sri Lanka. Blunt's playbook on repeat. Governments package unsustainable debt as investment vehicles, backed by the full faith and credit of nations that have no credit left. And when the inevitable collapse comes, it's not just investors who suffer, it's entire populations. We have not broken the pattern. We have perfected it. Accelerated it. Scaled it to global proportions. The question is no longer whether the next Isabella, Maire, or Blunt exists. Statistics guarantee they are already at work. Some brilliant mind in a London hedge fund or Singapore trading desk is right now designing the financial instrument that will define the 2030s. It will be elegant. Revolutionary. It will solve a real problem in capital allocation or risk management. It will be celebrated. And it will contain within its mathematical beauty the mechanism of its own destruction. Because the pattern is not a bug. It is a feature. Financial markets reward innovation and punish stability. They favor those who move first and those who move fastest. Caution is penalized. Complexity is celebrated. And by the time we understand the systemic risks embedded in any new instrument, it is already too late. The innovation has metastasized throughout the financial system, woven into the balance sheets of banks, pension funds, and sovereign wealth funds. We are, all of us, invested in the next catastrophe. We just don't know which one yet. The optimists will say, but we have regulators now. Central banks. Stress tests. Circuit breakers. Surely we've learned from history? To which history responds with bitter laughter. Venice had the Council of Ten. Amsterdam had the States General. London had Parliament. Each intervened. Each imposed new rules. And each time, the financial engineers simply moved the risk somewhere the regulators weren't looking. Complexity migrated to shadows. Innovation relocated to less regulated jurisdictions. The machine adapted. It always adapts. Isabella Rossetti died in obscurity, her genius stolen and her gender ensuring she would be erased from the history she helped create. But her mathematical framework for insurance, the idea that risk could be quantified, distributed, and priced, underpins trillions of dollars in modern finance. Isaac Maire died in exile, branded a criminal for inventing short selling. Today, short sellers are celebrated as market disciplinarians who expose fraud and correct overvaluation. John Blunt died in disgrace, the architect of Britain's greatest financial scandal. Today, sovereign debt markets function on precisely the principles he pioneered. The villains become visionaries. The crimes become conventions. And the cycle continues. So here we stand, at the end of 2025, watching new financial innovations bloom like toxic flowers. Decentralized finance promising to eliminate middlemen while creating ungoverned markets susceptible to manipulation that would make Maire weep with envy. Artificial intelligence designing derivative strategies too complex for human comprehension. Fractional ownership of everything from real estate to art to intellectual property, securitized and traded in markets with no regulatory framework. Each innovation solving a real problem. Each creating 10 new ones. Each building the scaffold from which the next crisis will hang us. The machine that Isabella, Maire, and Blunt built, the machine of modern finance, has no off switch. It has no reverse gear. It has only acceleration. More complexity. More leverage. More speed. More scale. And when the next collapse comes, not if, but when, it will be bigger than 2008. Faster than the flash crash. More devastating than the South Sea bubble. Because each iteration of the pattern teaches the system how to fail more spectacularly. We call this progress. We call this evolution. We call this the invisible hand of the market. But look closely at that hand. See how its fingers are curled not in blessing but in a fist. See how it's not guiding us forward but dragging us toward the event horizon of systemic collapse. The pattern doesn't break because we don't want it to break. We want the returns. We want the innovation. We want to believe that this time is different. That we're smarter. That we've learned. We haven't. 3 centuries from Isabella to now. 3 innovations that became weapons. 3 catastrophes that became footnotes. And tomorrow, somewhere, a brilliant mind is creating the next one. They're convinced they're solving a problem. Building something beautiful. Changing the world. They are. Just not in the way they imagine. History doesn't repeat. But it rhymes. And the rhyme scheme of financial collapse is mathematically perfect, predictably catastrophic, and absolutely inevitable. The only question that remains, will you recognize the next Venice, Amsterdam, or London before it burns? Or will you, like millions before you, mistake the flames for fireworks until it's too late? The wheel turns. The pattern holds. The machine accelerates. And somewhere in the gears, we're all Isabella, brilliant, doomed, and writing our obituary in the language of innovation we believe will save us. It won't.